There was a time when simply having a Zurich address meant something. Not just wealth, not just stability. Something deeper, a kind of untouchable permanence, as if the city itself existed outside the normal rules of history. The Alps behind it, the lake in front, the banks in between, and the understanding, shared by everyone who mattered, that whatever happened to the rest of the world, Zurich would hold. That understanding is quietly breaking down. If you have been paying attention to where the world's serious money has been moving over the last 3 years, you already sense that something is off. The conversations at Zurich's private banking tables have changed. The names on the accounts are shifting, and in the corridors of institutions that have existed for over a century, there is a particular kind of silence that was not there before. Not the silence of discretion, which Zurich has always worn like a second skin. Something else. The silence of departure. This channel documents the cities that history will remember not for their glory, but for how quietly they let it slip away. If you want to watch that process unfold in real time, before the headlines catch up, subscribe. What we are about to show you about Zurich changes the way you will look at the world's most trusted financial city forever. Because here is what most people still believe: Switzerland is invincible, neutral, permanent, a vault disguised as a country. And for a long time, that was not just a perception, it was a structural reality. But the structure has been shifting, piece by piece, for over a decade. And now the people who understood Zurich best, the ones who built their fortunes around its secrecy, its neutrality, its reliability, are making quiet arrangements to be somewhere else. This is not a collapse. Not yet. Empires rarely collapse, they drain. And Zurich, the capital of the world's most enduring financial empire, is draining. To understand how far it has come, you need to understand what Zurich actually was, not what it looked like from the outside, but what it functioned as from within. By the early 2000s, Swiss banks held an estimated 27% of all offshore wealth globally. $1 in 4 of the world's hidden, managed, and protected private wealth passed through Swiss hands. Zurich was not just a city in that system. It was the center of gravity, the place where the rules were written, where the relationships were maintained, where the discretion was institutionalized across generations. A private banker in Zurich was not simply a financial professional. He was, and the gender is historically accurate, a keeper of secrets, an archivist of wealth, a man whose entire value was built on the understanding that certain information would never move beyond a particular room. For most of the 20th century, that system was essentially unassailable. Swiss banking secrecy was enshrined in law in 1934. The numbered account, the iconic anonymized structure that made Zurich synonymous with untouchable privacy, became one of the most recognized symbols of financial power anywhere on earth. You did not need to say where you banked if you banked in Zurich. Everyone who needed to know knew. Everyone else did not matter. The wealth that flowed in was extraordinary. Latin American industrialists, Middle Eastern royalty, European aristocracy restructuring itself after the Second World War. Later, Russian oligarchs, Asian manufacturing fortunes, American tech wealth seeking international diversification. Zurich absorbed it all with the quiet efficiency of a system that had never failed and saw no reason it ever would. The Bahnhofstrasse, Zurich's central shopping boulevard, consistently ranked among the most expensive commercial real estate on the planet, became the physical expression of that wealth. Patek Philippe, Rolex, Cartier, Chanel, stores that existed not to sell products but to occupy space in a city that had become the world's most prestigious financial address. Walking the Bahnhofstrasse was not a shopping experience. It was a kind of confirmation, a proof of permanence. But here is where the first crack appeared. And it appeared not from inside Switzerland, but from the most powerful external force the Swiss financial system had ever faced. In 2009, the United States Department of Justice issued a demand that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. UBS, Switzerland's largest bank and one of the most systemically important financial institutions on earth, was ordered to hand over the names of American clients using Swiss accounts to evade taxes. not asked, ordered. Under threat of criminal prosecution that would have effectively barred UBS from operating in the American market, the Swiss government capitulated. 4,500 names were handed over. And in that moment, the foundation of the entire system, the absolute, legally protected, historically unbroken promise of banking secrecy was publicly breached for the first time in 75 years. What followed was not immediate panic. It was something more dangerous, a slow, methodical, institution-by-institution erosion. In 2014, Switzerland joined the OECD's Common Reporting Standard, agreeing to automatically share financial account information with the tax authorities of member countries. By 2018, over 100 jurisdictions were participating. The numbered account, that icon of Swiss financial mythology, was effectively made obsolete for any client seeking legal anonymity. The vault had developed a transparency that its entire architecture had been designed to prevent, and the billionaires noticed, not all at once. Empires do not empty in a day. But a former senior relationship manager at one of Zurich's oldest private banks described it plainly in a conversation with a Swiss financial journalist in 2022. The clients did not leave in anger. They left in silence. Over years, one by one, restructuring portfolios, moving assets, exploring alternatives, the really large clients, he said, were always thinking 10 steps ahead. By the time the regulations were fully in place, most of them had already moved. Where did they go? That question is the heart of this story, and its answer reveals something profound about how financial power actually relocates in the modern world. The first and most visible destination was Singapore. Throughout the 2010s, Singapore positioned itself with extraordinary strategic precision as the inheritor of everything Zurich was losing: lower tax rates, aggressive wealth management infrastructure, geographic proximity to the new centers of Asian wealth creation, and crucially, a political stability and legal framework that offered a version of the Swiss promise, updated for a world in which pure secrecy was no longer viable. What Singapore offered instead was discretion within compliance, a system that worked with international regulations rather than against them, while still offering the kind of institutional seriousness that serious money demanded. The numbers tell the story without ambiguity. In 2017, Singapore managed approximately $2 trillion in private wealth assets. By 2023, that figure had grown to over $4 trillion. In the same period, Switzerland's global share of offshore wealth management declined from roughly 27% to an estimated 22%, a fall that sounds incremental, but represents hundreds of billions of dollars in lost assets under management, with all the fee income, employment, and ancillary economic activity that follows. But the reallocation of wealth was only the beginning, because the second wave of departure was not about assets. It was about people. This is where Zurich's decline stops being a story about spreadsheets and becomes something you can feel when you walk through the city. There is a building on the Talstrasse, close to the old financial district, that a Zurich-based commercial real estate broker described in early 2024 as a different world from what it was in 2018. Prime office space in the city's core financial corridor, once occupied by private banking divisions and wealth management boutiques, has seen vacancy rates climb to levels that would have seemed impossible a decade ago. Some of the most prestigious addresses in European finance now have floors sitting empty, leases being renegotiated, footprints being reduced. Not because the firms are failing, because the people who made those offices necessary are not there anymore. The ultra-high net worth individuals, the category of wealth, generally defined as assets over $30 million, that drove Zurich's ecosystem, have been restructuring their residency in ways that would have been unimaginable when Switzerland held the monopoly on discrete global wealth management. The flat tax regime known as the lump sum taxation system, which for decades attracted foreign millionaires and billionaires to settle in cantons like Zug, Schwyz, and Zurich itself, is no longer the unique proposition it once was. Portugal, the UAE, Malta, and a growing number of jurisdictions have created competitive residency programs specifically designed to attract exactly the clients Switzerland is losing. A Greek shipping magnate, who might have spent 20 years domiciled in Zurich for tax purposes, now has 7 or 8 alternatives offering comparable or superior arrangements. And when the ultra-wealthy move their residency, they do not move alone. The ecosystem moves with them. The private bankers follow the clients. The family offices restructure. The lawyers relocate. The art advisors, the yacht brokers, the discreet fixers of every kind, the entire invisible economy that exists around concentrated generational wealth, slowly, quietly, migrates toward wherever the wealth has gone. A senior partner at a Zurich-based family office advisory firm, speaking without attribution to Swiss financial publication Finews in 2023, put it this way: "We are not fighting for the business anymore. We are fighting to understand where it went and why we did not see it leaving." If that sounds familiar, it should. It is the language of an empire in the second phase of its decline, not denial, which is the first phase, but bewilderment. The moment when the institutions that defined a city's power are still standing, still functioning, still prestigious on paper, but the energy that made them vital has relocated to somewhere else. But here is where it gets more unsettling. Because the pressure on Zurich is not only coming from above, from regulation and competition for ultra-wealthy clients, it is also coming from below, from a structural economic transformation that is reshaping the city itself in ways that have almost nothing to do with private banking. Switzerland has one of the highest costs of living in the world. Zurich, by most international indices, is the most expensive city in Europe and regularly competes with Singapore and New York for the title of most expensive city on earth. For decades, that cost was sustainable, even desirable, because the financial sector generated the kind of wealth that made Zurich's prices not just bearable but appropriate. The city was expensive because it was the center of the world's most profitable private wealth ecosystem. The two facts justified each other in a closed loop. That loop is opening. As assets under management decline, as headcounts in private banking shrink, as the boutique firms that once clustered around UBS and Credit Suisse consolidate or disappear, the economic justification for Zurich's cost structure is weakening. Young financial professionals, the next generation of bankers, analysts, and relationship managers that any financial center needs to renew itself, are running their own calculations and arriving at uncomfortable conclusions. A junior private banker in Zurich earns a competitive salary by Swiss standards. But when measured against the cost of a 2-bedroom apartment in Zurich 1 or Zurich 8, against the price of school fees, grocery bills, and the daily frictions of living in one of the world's most expensive cities, the math increasingly does not work. Not when Frankfurt, Amsterdam, and London, all of which have launched aggressive campaigns to attract Swiss financial talent, post-Brexit, and post-Credit Suisse, are offering comparable compensation at a fraction of the living cost. The Credit Suisse collapse in March 2023 deserves its own accounting here, because it was not simply a corporate failure. It was a symbolic rupture that echoed beyond any single balance sheet. Credit Suisse was founded in 1856. It financed the Swiss railway system. It helped build the industrial infrastructure of modern Switzerland. For nearly 170 years, it was not merely a bank, it was an institution so embedded in the identity of Swiss finance that its collapse was, for many inside the industry, genuinely unthinkable. The kind of thing that happened to other countries, not to Switzerland, not to Zurich. When UBS was forced to absorb Credit Suisse in an emergency rescue, orchestrated over a single weekend, a rescue that required the Swiss government to override shareholder protections that had been considered inviolable, message sent to the global financial community was not subtle. Switzerland's financial institutions were not immune to the forces of modern banking risk. The discretion, the stability, the permanence that the Swiss brand had carried for a century and a half, all of it was suddenly revealed to be contingent rather than absolute. And contingent is not a word that belongs in the vocabulary of private wealth management. A former managing director who had spent 20 years at Credit Suisse's private banking division described the aftermath in terms that resonated far beyond the immediate crisis. The clients who stayed through everything, through the regulatory changes, through the transparency requirements, through the loss of secrecy, they stayed because they still believed in the institution. After March 2023, some of them stopped believing. And when a private banking client stops believing, there is no argument that brings them back. Rome did not fall in a day, and neither does Zurich. But Rome also had its moment when the senators who had spent their careers insisting the empire was eternal quietly began making arrangements for what came next. The villas in the countryside, the diversified land holdings, the alternative power structures, not because they had given up on Rome, because they understood, at some level they could not publicly admit, that the permanence they had built their lives around was no longer guaranteed. Zurich is in that moment. The institutions are still there. The Bahnhofstrasse still has its stores, though the foot traffic data from Swiss retail associations shows a measurable decline in average transaction values in the luxury segment since 2021. The private banks are still operating. UBS, now the last major Swiss universal bank, manages more assets than ever after absorbing Credit Suisse, but manages them with a significantly smaller Swiss workforce, more geographically distributed, less anchored to Zurich than at any point in the institution's history. The people who built careers on the understanding that Zurich was the permanent center of the global private wealth universe are increasingly working for institutions that have quietly decentralized that center. Singapore, Hong Kong, despite its political complications, Luxembourg, which has steadily expanded its share of European fund management at Switzerland's expense, and increasingly, Abu Dhabi and Dubai cities that have invested enormous political capital in building financial ecosystems specifically engineered to attract exactly the clients and institutions that Zurich is struggling to retain. There is a particular irony in the timing. Switzerland spent the second half of the 20th century cultivating a reputation so powerful, so consistent, so institutionally embedded, that it seemed to transcend the normal competitive forces that reshuffled financial power in other eras. And it worked, brilliantly, for longer than almost any comparable national financial position in modern history. But that very success created a structural complacency, a deep institutional assumption that the Swiss model was self-sustaining, that the reputation alone would keep the capital coming regardless of how the world around it changed. It did not. It never does. Venice made the same assumption about its monopoly on Eastern trade routes. The City of London made it about sterling's global reserve status. Detroit made it about the automobile. Every empire that has ever believed its position was permanent has eventually been educated otherwise, usually not by a single catastrophic event, but by an accumulation of small decisions made by rational actors who concluded, one by one, that somewhere else made more sense. That is what is happening in Zurich. Rational actors, one by one, concluding that somewhere else makes more sense. Not because Zurich has become bad, but because the gap between what Zurich costs and what Zurich uniquely offers has narrowed to the point where the calculation is no longer automatic. And once a financial center loses its automatic quality, once serious money has to debate the question rather than simply defaulting to the answer, the trajectory tends in only one direction. What comes next for Zurich is not obliteration. The city is too structurally deep, too institutionally rooted, too geographically stable to face the kind of rapid implosion that overtook Detroit or the sudden reorientation that reshaped Hong Kong after 2019. What Zurich faces is something that, in some ways, is harder to manage and harder to reverse, a slow, compound diminishment of its position at the center of global financial power, a transition from singular, irreplaceable hub to one node among several respected, functional, expensive, and no longer necessary in the way it once was. The Bahnhofstrasse will still have its boutiques, the lake will still be beautiful, the trains will still run on time, because Swiss trains always run on time. But the particular kind of gravity that made Zurich the address, The city where the world's wealth came to rest, to be protected, to be managed across generations that gravity has been weakening for over a decade. And in the last 3 years, since the transparency regulations matured, since Credit Suisse fell, since Singapore reached critical financial mass, the weakening has become visible to anyone paying close attention. The billionaires who built their lives around Zurich's permanence are not making dramatic exits. They are making quiet, rational, portfolio-level decisions that happen to have a directional pattern: assets moving, residencies restructuring, relationships transferred to offices in other jurisdictions. The kind of departure that does not make headlines, because no one does anything dramatic enough to warrant a headline, but which, in aggregate, is the most significant reorientation of private wealth management geography in half a century. Empires do not fall in a day, they fall in patterns. And if you know what the patterns look like, the regulatory erosion, the institutional rupture, the gradual departure of the people who understood the center of gravity better than anyone, then what is happening to Zurich is not a mystery. It is a chapter in a story that has been written before, in different cities, in different centuries, with the same ending. The question is not whether Zurich will lose its position as the unchallenged capital of global private wealth. That has already happened. The question is how far the process goes and what the city becomes on the other side of it. History is not encouraging on that front. Financial empires that lose their singular status tend not to recover it. They find a new equilibrium at a lower level of global influence, with a smaller share of the world's attention and capital than they once commanded. They become, in the language that their own former clients now use, one option among several, respected, functional, no longer the answer. Zurich had everything: the secrecy, the stability, the infrastructure, the reputation that took a century and a half to build, and now, quietly, methodically, rationally, the people who made all of that matter are deciding they have options. The cracks were always there. The signs were always there. They were just easier to ignore when the numbers still went up and the waiting lists at the private banks were still full. They are not as full as they were. Tell us in the comments which financial capital you think follows Zurich. The pattern is already visible in at least 2 other cities we are watching. Subscribe. Empire Falls documents the decline that serious analysts see coming, before the mainstream media admits it is real. The next chapter is already loading.